So I'll hit record. And would you like to start with the instrument critique? Let me just back up to that assignment. What questions do you have?
Well, I already turned mine in, but it was more an observation of this is a really hard assignment for me. I did my best, but what was hard for me is that, you know, I critiqued the LACE index and they used the C statistic to look at the ability for it to predict readmissions and assess discrimination, but there wasn't too much that I found on reliability. So I felt like there was a lot that I cited. I haven't had an assignment like this before, and I'm kind of worried, I guess, about the class in general. I think what I'm asking is I'm just nervous about it because it seems like we're thinking on another level, and I haven't really done it before. Yeah. So I'm kind of nervous about it.
And this particular assignment, really, it relied on you kind of going to the textbook and looking up those terms and then trying to decide if they did those specific types of reliability and validity. And, you know, they're listed for you here in the assignment, but what I suspect is that most of you did not find even probably half of these things addressed because it's pretty hard to find all of them. So, so hopefully you could figure out what the level of measurement was in the particular tool that you were looking at just from the description of what they were measuring. But the reliability, if they mentioned test, retest, you can report that. If they didn't, then you say it wasn't reported. If they talked about inter-rater or intra-rater reliability, you can absolutely report that. But again, not every instrument has that reported. And then the reliability coefficients, it sounds like you did find some things there. But those are the things that we're looking for, the internal consistency and generalizability. And then the validity is, did they have experts look at it and say, yes, this is a good way to measure these things? Did they have any content validity cited in the articles and criterion validity or concurrent validity? Those are the things that you're just going to look for when you read the articles about the instrument. And especially if you found an article that described the instrument development, you might have found a little bit more of that. Convergent and discriminant validity are the things that if they used a similar tool, like two different pain measures and both pain measures had similar scores, that's called convergent validity. Discriminant validity would be like a comfort measure compared to a pain measure. And you would expect different scores on those. They'd be, if comfort was higher, you'd expect pain to be lower. So those are the kinds of things that go into that. But again, you're not punished by what people didn't do. You just have to comment on whether or not you could find those things addressed.
Okay, that makes me feel a lot better because I feel like I definitely did that. And I also tried to address, like for me, most of the articles I found all address the C statistic for discrimination, but like not discriminant validity. You know what I mean? Like they were kind of like, of course,
yeah,
discrimination, but not discriminant validity. Like,
yeah, and unfortunately, that's sort of the nature of the beast with measurement around a lot of things that nurses care about. And I think really the point of this whole assignment is to have you look critically at what's out there that you can use and know that it might not be the strongest possible measure. And just be aware of that, because it'd be it would be kind of sad to waste all your time doing a study using something that really isn't gonna be reliable or valid in answering your question. So that's kind of the point of all this, is to pick it apart and see what you can find. Are there?
That makes me feel a lot better.
Good.
And I guess I'll comment, I may have overanalyzed it, having taken measurement this last summer.
I'm quite sure you did, because your level of knowledge is going to be much higher. So I will be thrilled to see the other course knowledge reflected in this assignment. But I will not be expecting it from people who have not had that. But yes, exactly. You get it, because you had an entire course on it.
Okay. don't count me points out for it.
No. I will not. Absolutely not. Are there other questions on this assignment, or shall we go to the other one? Hearing none, I will switch. Now, I think when you all were in intensives, we did confirm that everybody had a true experimental design study. But I don't want anybody to waste their time doing this assignment on a study that doesn't meet the criteria. So I just want to go on the record one more time of saying you need a treatment and a control group, you need an intervention, and they need to be randomized. So those are the criteria for a true experimental design. And if they have those things, it meets the criteria for true experimental design. And then you're going to critique those studies. Again, same thing, you're going to really pick it apart. And because I think mostly because of lack of space when you go to publish, people rarely have everything in there that that needs to be in there. And you, again, won't lose points if that article doesn't have it in there, but you need to critique it. So, so for this assignment, I need you to give me the article and your critique. And you really want to critique, is there logical consistency in the study? Is what they're talking about doing congruent with the theoretical framework? Now, a lot of times, as we've already talked about, a lot of times there isn't a theoretical framework, so you're going to cite that as a weakness of the study. Does their review of the literature identify a gap they're trying to fill, and then that purpose comes from that gap? The research questions and or hypotheses should come from the research question, and then the design should flow from that. They should tell you what their operational definitions are. So how are they going to measure pain? How are they going to measure comfort? And then is their analysis consistent with the question? And is it consistent with the measures? So if they say they're going to use chi-square, that means they're comparing categorical variables, versus if they say they're going to do a paired t-test, they're going to do two measures from the same individuals, pre and post. If they do the independent t-test, they could be two groups, before and after something. So, so those are the things that you'll be looking for the logical consistency. And then your critique needs to include assessment of the theoretical framework for the study and whether it was adequately explained and documented by a primary source. So primary source is like if you pull out a theory book and cite the theory book, that's not the primary source. primary source would be, like for caring, it's going to be one of Gene Watson's pieces, or there were several really good theories in your PICO question, and you guys had cited the original sources very well. So I don't think that's going to be an issue, but you just need to say whether or not, and a lot of the studies, especially outside of nursing, don't mention it at all. So you just say they didn't mention a theory. You're going to critique the review of the literature and really kind of critically analyze and synthesize the strengths and weaknesses of the previous work is what they should have done. And you're going to just critique, is there something you know about that they didn't cite? And did they really critically analyze these studies, or did they give you just a couple of, this study was done, that study was done, another study was done, but really don't build a case for why their study needed to be done? Do you have questions about that? I'm assuming because you all are doing this or trying to focus this on your area of interest, that you will know about the literature in the area, most likely more than I do. So you'll be able to critique if there's something important missing. Or obviously, it depends on when the study was published, but up to the point where they published, was there something done that they missed? And then your critique needs to evaluate the research question for clarity and the current knowledge on the concept. So if you're proposing some, if they are proposing, let's use the asthma meds as an example again. If they're proposing to do a study to see whether corticosteroids work to decrease asthma symptoms in kids, and we know there's how many Cochrane reviews on that topic, that's not new. But if they propose to see how it works for, and I forget which one of you are doing that. Is that, that's not you, Alicia, is it?
No, that's Suzanne's work.
Suzanne's asthma and her, yeah.
Okay, Suzanne's. So if you're proposing it in a different population, that makes it a different question. Or if you're proposing a different, something different, it may be filling a different gap. Are there questions about that? Yours is on.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the article I found is talking about the intervention. It's kind of an instrument and a process both. And then they refer to another paper where they actually did it for the first time, but they do go into detail in the second paper that I'm using. So I didn't know if that was, do I need to include both of those evaluations? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that's really a good thing. If you have multiple articles that have used it, the authors may have actually commented on different things, and that will make your critique much richer. But you're going to focus the critique of one of the articles, but you can use the other one to supplement or rationalize some of what they did. Does that make sense?
Yes, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that was all right, not to critique both.
Yeah, no, you don't need to critique both. Just pick one.
Okay.
If there's something
Okay.
helpful to add to your paper in the other one, just cite it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions about that? So I think we're down here to critiquing the sample section. So you want to know what the target population, who are they targeting for the intervention? And then how do they select the sample? They really should have both inclusion and exclusion criteria reported. It's really important to talk about attrition rates. So if we say that we recruited 50 people and there were 25 in the treatment and 25 in the control, and we only have follow-up data on 5 control patients, that's just a really big issue with attrition, and we can't really draw conclusions about that. Do they address the adequacy of the sample size? And remember, we talked about citing a power analysis, and a lot of times it's hard to find that as well. Sometimes they'll use a little bit different language to talk about the power, and they'll just say, you know, adequacy of sample size was determined a priori. That just means before the study was done. You want to also comment on whether or not it was a random assignment to treatment, if it was appropriate. One of you, and I can't remember who, but somebody had, I think, a cluster randomization, so they randomized by clinical site or something like that rather than individual patients. And that's still considered random assignment as long as their analysis was taking those clusters into account. So that's another thing that just strengthens the study. The protection of human subjects needs to be addressed, and they need to talk about providing consent and no coercion and protection of privacy and confidentiality. If there's animals involved, they need to speak to that. And then you're going to talk about the methodology next. I don't know how much of this is covered for you guys, but so you're going to talk about the procedures, including the method of data collection. Was that clearly described so you could replicate it? What are their threats to internal and external validity? And again, you may need to think through, turn to those pages in your textbook and look at those just to remind yourself. But could there be possible contamination? And that's many times why we randomize by site and not individual patients in a clinic if we're trying something new. History, is there something else going on concurrently that may influence the outcomes that they're measuring? And I mean, it can be things like gender. Are there gender differences? So you want to just speak to whether or not they had controlled for those. Can anybody think of how we try to control for those in a true experimental design? No brave souls tonight. So the whole point of a true experimental design is actually that if you have adequate power to determine the sample size and then you randomize, it's supposed to take care of all those threats to internal and external validity. If you have an instrument that actually can measure what you want to measure, and if you can assure that the people in the intervention group got the intervention. So some kind of measure of adherence to the intervention or attendance, if it's like classes, or you just want to assure that they actually got the intervention. Questions about that one?
No, thank you for explaining it.
And then you're going to critique the operational definitions for all the variables, and that's basically how are they going to measure this stuff. So what are they going to use to measure the concepts they're interested in? And does it make sense? Are they congruent with conceptual definitions? And sometimes they're a little bit, you need a little bit of an explanation to understand why they're using that measure, but that's their responsibility to convince you that that measure is a good way to measure that concept. And I guess a good example of that from one of the nurses I'm working with at Children's is what she's really interested in is if psychiatric nurses are working at the top of their scope. And there's really not a measure out there that she can find. And if one of you guys has seen one, you should let me know and I'll pass it on to her. But what she really wants to know are these nurses really working at the top of their scope? And because she thinks that has a lot to do with job satisfaction and retention and that kind of stuff. And she can't find a measure for working at the top of the scope for psych nurses. And what she's worried about is that many of them are just being used to pass meds and not really doing like psychotherapy with patients. So what she's settling on is the job satisfaction and intention to leave. But she truly is interested in that top of scope. So that's just an example of coming up with the measures that are congruent with that idea of if they're working at the top of their scope, we'd expect them to have better job satisfaction and less intention to leave. And then on those measures, again, you're going to speak to whether or not they talked about the reliability and validity of the measures. So did they convince you they were using the right measure for the concept they're interested in? And then is this a reliable and valid measure? And then the analysis section is evaluated by, did they tell you what their alpha was set before they started the study? And I think we talked a little bit about this. We usually set alpha at 0.05 for most studies. There are some studies where an adequate sample size is just impossible to get. And so you may have what we call a relaxed alpha and set it at 0.1. And an example of that would be like treatment for a really rare condition where there's no way you're going to recruit enough subjects to measure the differences between the two groups, and where the clinical significance is if you could do something that would help even a few of these patients, it would be clinically significant. So you can make the case for relaxing the alpha. And then we've talked a lot about make sure that they are proposing the right statistics, and it needs to match with their research question, their hypotheses, and their level of data. And so your results, then you really want to look at did they present the results for summary scores, and did they say whether or not they met the assumptions of the statistical procedures? Was significance reported with respect to the alpha that they selected ahead of time? Did they have post hoc analyses related to their original research question or hypotheses? They shouldn't go on a fishing expedition afterwards looking for something. So it should all relate to the original research question and the original analysis plan. So remember, an example for this is like if they used ANOVA. ANOVA tells you if there's a significant difference in any of the groups. So you could have 3 groups, pre and post, and it would just say there's significant differences, but you don't know between what until you do those post hoc tests. So again, depending on what they use to analyze the data, you're going to need to go do a little exploring in your textbook and see if you can figure out if those were the right things to do. The interpretation section is critiqued for the discussion of the findings in relation to the theoretical framework and the previous literature. So they need to tell you what the strengths and weaknesses of their study was. You need to critique that section to say they identified strengths and weaknesses, but they didn't mention all these other things that I found. And then you can speak to the practical or clinical significance versus the statistical significance. If they say they found a difference, it should be a statistically significant difference. If they say that they saw a trend in the data that might be clinically significant but no statistical significance, you can write it up that way. But they really have to be clear on whether or not it was statistically significant. There should be a research and a practice implications section, but they shouldn't overstate that. So if this is the first study that's been done with a new treatment and it hasn't been replicated yet, they shouldn't overstate and say everybody should be switching to this new way because I found the latest and greatest with this one study in this one population. It should be stated more like this shows promise and needs to be replicated. So you just want to critique how well they did with the research and practice implications. So questions about any of that?
No, I'll probably have to process everything, and then I'm sure like I'll have questions later on this week.
Yeah, and I am on the road until Wednesday, but I will be home Thursday and Friday, and I'll be trying to check my mail in between meetings so that I can get back to you. Because if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Thank you for that. I spent some time, you look at it, you think you understand it, you compare it to the paper, you go back and forth, and sometimes I just can't make that decision if it's there or not there. Yeah, okay, thanks. So we can email you that stuff?
Yeah.
Those questions, okay.
So it might be helpful if you're emailing a question where I need to look at the article, if you would attach that to the email question, that would be really helpful.
Okay, thanks.
And I suspect if you're having trouble finding these things in the article, it's because they're not there. And we've kind of talked about this before, but it's not that uncommon for things to be missing despite the fact that they're getting published. That's the point of this, is just to critique what's there and what's not there. and how well this particular study was done. And I think it was 2 last year. We found sort of critical flaws in the study, and it's alarming to me that that's happening because they are supposed to be peer reviewed before they're published. But don't be surprised if somebody finds something that you think, this just doesn't seem right. So what other questions do you guys have?
I have a question that just popped into my brain, but it's still back on validity, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You don't have to change the assignment. Because we were talking about construct validity. My question for that is in my book when I was reading it. This is the question I had last week. I should have emailed you about it. But it said that the way to look or test for construct validity was, let me look at my book. It was convergent validity and discriminant validity. If they don't have construct validity, then they're not going to have the other two, right? Or test for them. Or can you?
Well, there's so construct validity means, are they measuring what they think they're measuring? So there's a variety of ways to do that, and that is, I think you can have experts on that particular construct evaluate it and say yay or nay. You can use a similar tool that has established construct validity on that particular construct. And if you come up with similar, sort of like we talked with the convergent or discriminant, then you can say it has construct validity based on what you've done. But I think you can also have experts review it and say, yes, this is a valid way to measure that. But
I see.
Most often what you're going to get reading them, though, is that they don't mention that at all. And they don't do the
right.
And they don't do the test. So that's how you're going to critique it. Here's what they gave me, and I don't know any of these other things.
Got it. Okay, so I just said, they don't talk about construct validity at all.
Yep.
So I didn't even mention the two tests because they didn't do those either. Okay, that makes sense. And I was just wondering for this assignment too, it's kind of like the same thing. If they don't have it, then you don't have to go down the line of all the pieces. They just don't have it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say, there was no mention of.
Okay. That helps a lot.
And that makes it a real weakness of the study. If they don't convince you as the reader that the data they collected is measuring what they cared about, how do you know what to make of the results? So that goes into, one of the weaknesses.
Okay.
Other questions?
When you, Bonnie, when you find reference to particular, they based their for this paper tonight. They based their instrument on a couple other well-known tools, and they mentioned those, and they were done back in the 80s, and they said that those were actually worked up for validity and reliability. Do we need to go back and make sure that was done?
No,
or
you can cite that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that actually, to me, is an example of how they're saying that they have convergent validity. Did they use both of them, or they just said it was based on that?
They use both to kind of bring together their intervention, their tool.
Yeah, so that's, I would say that's a strength, that if there's reliability and validity of those two instruments, and they're using reliable and valid instruments combined, you know, it still needs to be tested and they still should report. But that gives you some confidence that this should be a good measure.
Okay. That makes it more clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of ran into the same thing where I was looking at the LACE index, and what was interesting is for large general surgical population, it seemed like the prediction was close in terms of if you have a higher score, you're more at risk for readmission. If you have a lower score, you're less. But depending on where you are in the hospital and your patient population, you might have to decide where that cutoff actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 8? Is it 10? And then some of the other weaknesses was like, if you're going to focus on a specific patient population, you'd have to assess it because the studies on targeted or specific patient populations were various. So that's interesting. So I think that makes sense. Because I kind of ran into that too, where I was like, oh, like, what am I going to target for my assignment? And then would I have to reevaluate this, like find a more specific measure?
Yeah, that's good. That's a strength of the instrument if they're combining established instruments. And what you were describing also is if it's corresponding with the outcomes that in the predicted direction, that also suggests it's a stronger instrument.
It was so weird because they didn't talk a lot about like reliability or things like that. It was just more predictive, like analysis. Like, did it predict, you know, in this population kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm glad we did it because I do need to look at it because I'm thinking maybe I need to reconsider because I was thinking about focusing on a specific surgical population for my DNP project. So I'm like, oh, I might need to find something specific to that patient population, but there might not be anything that exists. So you may have to use it knowing that it might not be the best tool, but there isn't a tool.
Yeah. And the other thing you can do is if there's a way to look at any of these things, can you establish some of the reliability and validity of these measures in the work that you do? And that may or may not be possible, but it definitely is another gap in the literature related to a lot of the measures out there.
Yeah, that's interesting because I do think it's a gap. Because once I started doing this, I started looking at that and I was like, oh my gosh, there's nothing on this.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. We decided to do that with the questions on the Heart Smart Kids measure. So we came up with this pediatric primary care screening tool for childhood obesity that asks about the things in the guidelines. So sugar sweetened beverages, eating breakfast, how much sleep they get, how much physical activity, how much screen time. So they're all based on evidence-based recommendations, but the measure, the questions we came up with were questions we came up with. So we tried to establish some reliability and validity of those questions by comparing it to another instrument that a lot of people were using. And we had a heck of a time getting the article published because people said, that's not a gold standard. It's just another instrument with the same kind of questions. So, they really wanted a study that had compared kids using the gold standard. So like 24-hour dietary recall for the nutrition questions, wearing pedometers or step counters for the physical activity and the sleep questions. And, we just didn't do that. We didn't have funding to do that. So that's the, the studies, if really well done, should be comparing this measure to whatever the gold standard is. And sometimes the gold standard is something so expensive or difficult to measure that people can't do it. So there's a lot of weaknesses in the measures that we have available. So any other questions that anybody wants to ask? And I'm assuming nobody needs the next quasi-experimental study yet, right? Nobody's looking that far ahead.
I am.
Do you have questions about that one?
So my understanding is you want some type of study that does not have a random randomization associated with it. So
Yep.
Any other tips to be looking for?
Yeah, no, that's, there has to be an intervention, but it can lack either the control group or the randomization. But there has to be an intervention. So quasi-experimental means it doesn't meet the criteria for experimental, but there does have to be an intervention. That's a really good question. And they should use quasi-experimental in the description of the design, but again, I'm astounded sometimes when I read things and they don't help you with that. But usually it's the lack of randomization.
Okay, this is gonna be a tough one for me to find much, but I'll look.
Yeah, it is gonna be hard for you with the things around diabetes and outcomes and asthma and outcomes. They usually have a control group so they can draw some conclusions. If you could find a pre-post that somebody did, or just a convenience sample control.
Okay.
Those would meet the criteria.
To that end, some of the studies I was looking at did some qualitative kind of exploration first before they started the actual study, and then they include some comments on that. And so can we just make a comment on what they did to kind of define their population or their sample? It seems like that's what they were doing. Does that make sense? Like they gave a kappa level.
Yes, they absolutely can do a mixed methods, and you can critique just the either experimental design or the quasi-experimental design part of that. That's fine.
Okay.
Because
okay.
Your qual class is going to teach you how to do the qualitative critique. But absolutely. And I may have already shared this bias with you in the past, but my biased opinion is mixed methods is usually the way to get the best answers to our questions. So I'm a big fan of those kinds of studies. You just don't have to critique both the qual and the quant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Not for me, thank you.
Well, feel free to email if questions come up as you're working on these, knowing that I'm flying around, but we'll get back to you.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts that anybody wants to talk about before?
Oh, I just had a thought about your other colleague who is trying to find a scale
Oh,
for
yeah.
measuring the highest level. Because I've been doing a lot of reading about nurse practitioner groups and them working at their highest level. And I know the Meisner scale of job satisfaction is sometimes combined with the ATS scale, which is the scale for anticipated turnover.
Okay. So it sounds like she's on the right track with doing the
Yeah.
job satisfaction and the turnover.
There,
Would you mind sending me the names of those two scales that I can forward to her? Because I know the concepts are the same, but I
Mhm.
don't know if the measures she's looking at are the same that you
And
mentioned.
yeah, I'll also throw in another one where they have another. I haven't looked at the validity or reliability of this one, but it's the conditions of work effectiveness, because
Oh,
that's another piece that ties into empowerment in the workplace, and so that's also one of the other scales that is out there. And so I see studies using 2 or 3 of these pieces.
Yep.
And there was one that was evaluating certified nurses who worked with multiple sclerosis, and were they working to their highest level. So there's some parallels out there already.
yep, good. That's reassuring to me because I don't know that literature. It seemed like a reasonable way to approach it, but if there are studies out there doing it that way, that's reassuring to us.
There is.
That'd be
So I'll send you that.
And that's the value of sharing the knowledge between your cohort members and yourself, because you guys collectively, if we looked at everything that you're reading, wow, one person can't do it all, but you can share with each other. And we hope you get in the habit of doing that.
All right.
And thank you for sharing with me, and I will send it to her.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Great. Any other thoughts anybody has?
I think I'm set.
Was there another comment? Anything that anybody else wants before we sign off?
I got nothing else, thanks.
Thanks for joining us. I know this time frame makes it hard on your patients, so appreciate your willingness.
That's okay, I just worked through lunch then.
That's not healthy.
No, but we get it done.
It's not. I'm pretty sure it has an effect on your insulin level, right?
Actually keeps it very stable.
It's low, hypoglycemia all day long.
All right, you have a good trip.
All right, you guys, let me know if you have questions.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yep, talk to you next week. Anything else, Carrie?